do expect you to be taking some quick notes, write down a phrase, write down some sort of summary, but it certainly does not need to be every single word. So let's first talk about the respiratory system. We also consider this the gas exchange. So before we get going with some of the notes, I want you guys to think and answer this question, okay? The question is, why do we breathe? Okay, so think of all the reasons why we need a respiratory system. So really thinking about that, try to think of some things that we've learned in the past, right? This is not the first time we've talked about oxygen. When else have we talked about oxygen? Why might it be important, right? So we can survive. Good, Logan. So if you can give me a little bit more about that. What do you mean survive? Survive what? Why does gas exchange sound like people farting at each other? That is a very good question. And also, don't know. I think that is a very interesting interpretation of the word, of the term. Okay, so why do we think we breathe? So we need it so we can survive. Survive how? How would breathing help us survive? To create energy and keep you moving. Okay, Ava, what do you mean by create energy? Tell me a little bit more about what you mean by that. Hi, Spencer. What do we mean create energy and keep you moving? To release the energy stored in glucose. Good. So we're starting to make connections here. What is that process called when we're trying to release the energy that's stored in glucose? What is that called? Do you remember? Cellular respiration. Good. So that is fantastic. So we have this terminology, right? We've used respiration in a couple of different ways. We use respiration when we talk about cellular respiration, which is breaking down the glucose in the mitochondria to make ATP, just like Owen suggested and Eva alluded to and Logan started, right? The respiratory systems are the organs in animals that exchange gases with the environment, and respiration, an everyday term, is often used to mean breathing. So we have these different terms: cellular respiration, respiratory, respiration, and we're really going to be focusing on respiration in the sense of breathing, right? Exchanging gases with the environment. So really paying attention to that. So the function, you might want to write some of this down. Again, remember to be writing it down in your own words. Do not try to write down every single thing that you see on this slide, okay? It's not necessary. So really just picking out the big key words. But the respiratory system is what allows animals to move oxygen, which we need for cellular respiration, into the body tissues and to remove carbon dioxide, which is one of the waste products of cellular respiration, from our cells. Okay, so again, you don't necessarily need to write all of this down. An example of what you can write down is respiratory system lets us take in oxygen and remove carbon dioxide. Boom. That's all. Right? And that's really what the respiratory system is. And I told you guys that during cellular respiration, when we learned about this in first quarter, that the whole reason that we breathe is solely for us to be able to break down that glucose into ATP, right? We talked about photosynthesis and we talked about cellular respiration, how they complement each other. And we talked about how we need to get that oxygen that the plants give off in photosynthesis for us to be able to break it down. Good. And just as an extra measure, does anyone remember at what stage in cellular respiration the carbon dioxide is given off as a byproduct? Does anyone remember that from quarter one? Just bonus points if you do. You don't need to. Anyone want to guess? There's 3 stages. You have a 33% chance of getting it correct. You've got to choose between glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. Which one of those 3? The second stage. Yes, Ava. Yes, it was the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle. Good. Yes, that's exactly right. Good. Okay. So the way that we exchange gas is by the process of diffusion, right? So remember that we learned about the term diffusion specifically when we did the Agri Lab. Now I remember that we weren't able to do the Agri Lab because you didn't necessarily have the materials. I think some people got it in time and they did it and some others did not. But remember that diffusion is when there is passive, right? So meaning there's no energy needed. It goes from a high gradient to a low gradient. So moving from high concentration, so lots of gases move into areas of low concentration where there aren't as much. So when we talk about that, we're really talking about these molecules, oxygen molecules, moving through one stage to the other, or one area to the other. So animals use diffusion. Some of them do it through their skin, right? We really talk about aquatic animals getting that oxygen that's in the water, right? H2O, getting those oxygen molecules through their skin is one way of doing it. And they have a low metabolic rate, right? So why might these animals have a low metabolic rate? And all of these are aquatic animals. Why? Why do you think that the animals that need to allow gas to diffuse through their skin are aquatic and have a low metabolic rate? Think about metabolism, right? What is the metabolism? So what do we think it is? Why are all these animals aquatic and why do these have low metabolic rate? Give you guys a chance to think about that. Let's start with the second question, right? Does being aquatic mean that they have a low metabolic rate? Metabolic rate. Wow, that was hard. It's a good question, Logan. I think that there is a connection, right? Why might that? My gosh, why might that connection be? Right? That's a really good question. Think about the animals that they show on here, right? We've got the jellyfish, we've got flatworms. Yeah. So thinking about how they consume food, how they move, are they a really, really fast organism or do they they've got a slower rate of movement? Slower, right? If they are moving slower, are they burning more energy or less energy? Right. So if they're starting to if they're moving slower, they need less energy, meaning they don't need to burn as much, meaning they don't need as much oxygen. So why might all of the aquatic animals be diffusing the oxygen through their skin instead of having a respiratory system like we do or land animals? Okay, because they're aquatic and give me a little bit more and they can't breathe in water, right? Okay, so they don't need as much oxygen, right? They don't need as much because they're not burning as much. Good. So we're starting to see that there's this relationship. So we're going to talk about specialized structures that are found in um in animals, so or in fish specifically. So we've got something, there's different types of systems and there's different type of structures that are going to specialize with the type of organism, and that's going to test how we get oxygen into our bodies. So the structures specialize for gas exchange, and these are the 3 that you're going to want to remember. Okay, you're going to want to write these down. Now remember, we talk about these form and function. That's a very common and consistent theme that we're going to have in biology. This idea that the structure is something is specifically designed to help it. The structure of something is specifically designed for the function. So it is optimized to be able to excel at the function at which it is created for. So when we have gills, so these are aquatic animals. So these are the gills, right? We know that there's these folds right here by the ear, right where the ear would be, right over on the side. And there's a bunch of flaps. There's these bony flaps, and there's these thin folds of tissue. So there's these tissues that are kind of creating this gap, right? That are covering up this gap and allowing, and this is how they filter in the oxygen through the water. Then there's something called spiracles, and that is for terrestrial insects. So insects that are on the ground, and they have these different type of spiracles that are going to bring in oxygen from their environment. And then we see that there's these tracheas that are around here, right? So these tracheas are what's going to be around. And then we have the lungs, which is most terrestrial vertebrates. So we're going to talk a little bit about vertebrates and invertebrates. Now, you should have already been exposed to that. What is the difference between a vertebrate and an invertebrate? What is a vertebrate if you have a vertebrae, right? What's the difference? So one is a vertebrate, like a spine. Yes, Emmett, exactly. So if we talk about vertebrae as part of the spine, then vertebrates are organisms with a spine. But if we talk about invertebrates, what are invertebrates? Right? If we know that vertebrates are organisms with a spine, then invertebrates are going to be organisms without a spine. Good. Yes, they do have a little bit of cartilage. And some of them have something called an exoskeleton, meaning they have some sort of structure on the outside of their body that keeps their shape. Because remember, our spine is what keeps us from standing up and not just falling over, right? Like Gumby, if you guys remember Gumby. I don't know, maybe you guys are too young for Gumby. But we have something called a countercurrent exchange. And so we have a concurrent exchange and then a countercurrent. And so this is two different ways that we exchange oxygen. So in a concurrent system, the exchange is inefficient, meaning that the equilibrium is reached only at one end. And then in a countercurrent system, the equilibrium is not reached. So gas exchange continues and then eventually increases the efficiency. Now, this isn't something that you'll necessarily need to remember, but it is good to know that there is this countercurrent exchange and a concurrent exchange. Okay. So when we talk about fish gills, this is one way that they're going to, this is one way that they work. So fish increase gas exchange efficiently using that countercurrent exchange. So remember, if we go back, this countercurrent exchange, which is where, it goes in with the one way and then it maximizes towards the end and then maximizes at the end and goes out the same way. Concurrent is when it's zero at the start and then it equals out at the ends and then goes out towards the end. So when we've got this fish who are going to be exchanging the efficiency using countercurrent, it's really talking about how oxygen is going to start coming in and then is going to get to the rest of the body. And then they're going to breathe the rest of it out or expel the byproduct. But running blood through the system in the opposite direction to water keeps a diffusion gradient throughout the entire exchange, meaning that as long as we're running it away from the source, that means that we're always going to have some sort of depletion or less amount, which causes that concentration gradient. Remember that oxygen is going to flow from high levels of concentration, so areas where there's lots of oxygen, to low level concentration where there's a little bit of oxygen. So if we continuously have that little bit, that one end being less than how much we start, we will always have this funnel. right? We'll always be sending oxygen. If we were to create a system where the end of the line has just as much oxygen as the outside of the system, we're not going to have as much oxygen flowing through. So when we're talking about that, it's actually beneficial for there to be less oxygen. So this deoxygenated blood than the oxygenated blood, so that way the water is always flowing through and it brings more and more oxygen to the organism. Okay, so what is the site of gas exchange in mammals? So we had a little chance to learn about this in our video, in our lesson, if you've already had a chance. So I want you guys to write in the chat when we're talking about mammals, right? So thinking about mammals, we know that these are the ones that have these are the ones that have live babies. They don't have eggs. Good. So we've got these different options, and we've got a couple people saying the first one, alveoli or ravioli. That's funny. The alveoli. Okay. So anyone else have other opinions of what the answer is? I've gotten 2 responses. There's 18 of you. Anyone else think it could be the tracheids, the bronchi, the esophagus? One of these 4 options. Where do we think the gas exchange is in mammals? Okay, so we've got one for the bronchi. Yeah, what else? Okay. Well, one cool thing about the lungs is that it is broken down into remember that organization is also a key thing in biology. Everything is organized. So the way that we break this down, it goes from lungs and then it breaks it down into little tubes, and then those tubes break off into like branches, and then those branches break off. And then at the very end, we have something called the alveoli, right? So we do have the alveoli. The alveoli is the site of gas exchange. And we're going to learn a little bit about that. So really quickly, I'm going to, we're just going to talk about this as a class. I was going to break you guys into groups, but I think just for sake of time. So why are gills so widely seen in aquatic animals, but not in land animals? And one group of land animals that have gills is the isopods or pill bugs and sow bugs. Remember, these are also the ones that like the roly-polies, that if you touch it, they roll up into a ball. How can these organisms survive on land with gills? So you know what, actually, I do want to put you guys into groups. So I'm going to give you guys about 2 minutes, 3 minutes to discuss this into your groups. But really, the big question I want you to answer is, why are gills so widely seen in aquatic animals, but not land animals? Okay, so that's what I want you to focus on the first one. Let's set this up so that, let's do this. There are 18 people, so 6 rooms, 3. Okay. Why are animals in the water seen with gills, but not land animals? Okay. Talk about that. Great, welcome back. Okay, so let's go back to this question. Why are gills so widely seen in aquatic animals but not in land animals? Hmm.
Our group was discussing that they both need oxygen in different ways, and they just have different ways of extracting it from their environment because of the way that they adapt to their surroundings.
Good, Logan. That's great. So adapting to their surroundings, right? That they both need to get oxygen, but in different ways. Good. Okay. So what else? Right? We know that this is an adaptation. We know that this is something, that we need to get oxygen. So what's the difference in how we get oxygen and how aquatic animals get oxygen? Christian, you last said because gills are a special adaptation. Tell me more about that. Fish need to filter the oxygen, and so there are filters in their gills. Good. And do we need to filter the oxygen when we breathe in? No, right? We breathe in the air and whatever else is in it, and we take in the oxygen, which is also one of the reasons why pollution of the air is such a big deal because we don't have a way to only filter in the oxygen. We take everything in. And then it gets stored, right? It can damage our liver, or not our liver, our lungs and our tissue in our lungs, as well as breathe in the oxygen. So that's why it's really important to be clean, breathing in clean air. We talk about that all the time and how important it is for there to be clean air because there's no filter between the air and what we inhale. So we've got this really big parts of the respiratory system, and these include the trachea. So remember that we talked about in the digestive system, we talked about the esophagus. The esophagus is when we swallow food and it brings it to our stomach. But our trachea is the tube that's parallel, right? And that one is specifically talking about our lungs. If you bite into a food and swallow and you start coughing and you say it went down the wrong pipe, that's what we mean. It went, instead of going down your esophagus, it went down your trachea by accident. So good. Good, Christian. We're going to talk about that actually. Christian, you were saying how gills are a special adaptation for aquatic creatures, but land creatures were born without gills because there's no need for them, which is true. And it's interesting is that because we have, right, they talked, let me close the door because I can tell my bird's very loud. The aquatic animals was among the first, right? And so we actually evolved from, land animals evolved from aquatic animals. And when you think about what we also learned about when it comes to multicellular organisms and how aerobic, remember we talking about cellular respiration, aerobic respiration, which is when you go through cellular respiration and the presence of oxygen, was an adaptation. It evolved because there was a lot more oxygen available. And so then once we were able to do aerobic respiration, we were able to burn more glucose and have more energy to do things. And then that kind of led into this idea of trying to get as much oxygen, because the more oxygen that you can inhale, the more you can get it to your cells, and the more your cells can do cellular respiration and break down. That's why if you're a runner, you really need to learn how to breathe. Because if you can learn how to breathe a certain way while you run, you maximize the amount of oxygen that your cells get, meaning that your cells are able to burn the glucose and turn it into ATP and use that ATP molecules. So that's why if you are into sports, breathing is so important. And being able to regulate your breathing is so important because That's how you get stamina. That's how you can withstand and have more time. So parts of the respiratory system, we talked about the trachea. We talked about how that's oxygen that gets into your lungs. Then we talk about the bronchi, which are these different branches. And then it gets down to these bronchioles. So that even gets even into farther branches. And then we have the alveoli. So if we take a look at this bronchi, the bronchi are the two tubes that go down the trachea. We've got our esophagus back here. That was the one that swallows. Our oxygen goes down here. Our larynx. So our larynx has to do with our voice box, right? So this is how we create sound with our mouth and talk. And then the trachea, the bronchi, and then the bronchioles are these extra guys. And then the alveoli is the last bit. And that's where the site of gas exchange happens. So when we're talking about air going in and out, so inspiration, which is also inhalation, the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles contract. So the intercostal muscles are the ones that are under, right? We're talking about the lungs, which is protected by our rib cage. So if everyone takes that, so go ahead and do that one more time. So go ahead and take a deep breath. And as you take a deep breath, you can kind of feel your lungs pushing against your stomachs, right? Or not your stomachs, but your rib cage. And of course, remember that there are different ways that you can get oxygen, right? You can get it if you really focus on where your breath is going, you can start to contract these different muscles. And so when you breathe in, your lungs expand, your rib cage expands, and then you've got this diaphragm that's towards the end, and that is also going to contract downwards. If you're a singer, then you know what I'm talking about. If you like to sing, you know that when you sing, you're supposed to breathe into your diaphragm and then sing from there, because that's where you're going to get a lot more control over your breath. And then during exhalation, the muscles relax. The muscles start to decompress, and the rib cage kind of goes down, right? You kind of can feel when you take a deep breath and you let it out, right? We start to relax our muscles. So this is inhalation, exhalation. We know that we're starting to open up and expand some of the muscles, the lungs and the rib cage. So the alveoli, so the bronchi go into the bronchiole, and then this bronchiole at the end has this kind of little round thing, and that is the alveoli. So they are moist, thin-walled pockets, which are the site of gas exchange. So I would definitely write this down, because the alveoli is really where everything happens, right? So it's slightly oily, surfactant prevents the alveolar walls from collapsing and sticking together. So there's this little bit of oil that surrounds the membrane, so it keeps it from sticking and collecting and not being able to open as it should. Now, you don't have to write all of this down, but I'm going to walk us through. So we have the atriole, right? And this atriole is the branch of the pulmonary artery. So this has to do, remember that the blood is pumped from our heart. Our heart is what pumps our blood to go throughout our entire body. And our heart is located pretty close to our lungs because they work together. The blood, your heart is pumping to get the blood to your lungs so that it can release the byproducts, so that it can have you exhale the carbon dioxide. And then when your lungs are inhaling the oxygen, it wants to get to that blood, the blood cells, to get to the rest of your body. So they work together in this way. And so what we start to see is the blood gets brought down to these little sacs, these alveoli, and then they exchange, right? They release the carbon dioxide into that same sac while then taking in the oxygen and then send it out to the rest of your body. And then when you exhale, you're really exchanging that carbon dioxide out. Okay, so again, remember, you really just want to know this alveoli are moist, thin-walled pockets, which are the site of gas exchange. Is there any more time that you guys need on this slide to write this down? I can wait. And yes, Christian, it does look like nerves, right? All right. Okay, on to the next slide. So here's a little bit more of an explanation, right? So recall the interconnection. So the point where they really work together, okay, between the circulation and the respiratory system. So again, remember the circulation has to do with your heart, right? It has to do with the way that your heart is pumping the blood. And the gas exchange at the lungs and in the body cells moves oxygen into cells and carbon dioxide out. So remember, the entire thing about gas exchange really has to do with this oxygenated blood coming through. And this is your heart, okay? So first the gases move in and out of the lungs by breathing. Okay, so when you breathe, when you go in and out, really want to we really want to make sure that we are bringing in the oxygen and breathing out the deoxygenated blood. Or I'm sorry, the carbon dioxide. 2, oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged in the lungs by diffusion. Again, that's that semi-permeable membrane, right? We talk about how some of the cells have specialized instructions. We know that there are certain cells that are going to be specific in where they are and where they're located for a specific job. And in this case, the semi-permeability allows for some things to come in and some things to out. And our lung cells specifically, the alveoli, the lining of it is where we have our exchange through diffusion. And then gases are dissolved in the blood, are transported by the circular system. So that's when we have the deoxygenated blood from your right atrium and the right ventricle of your heart go through the lungs, and then they come back into your heart, and then they go through this system and they get pumped out to the rest of your body. So this heart it works perfectly aligned with our lungs. Christian, your question is, if our lungs are protected by our rib cage, why are our rib cage so sensitive? Well, I think it really just depends on what you mean by sensitive. Our ribs are actually phenomenally strong. Now, we have a lot of protection between that too, but our ribs are sensitive in the sense of breaking. You need to be falling on it a very specific way. And even then, to break ribs, you really need to have a lot of concentrated energy in one spot. And it provides as a cushion. It takes in, this is where physics comes in, right? It takes a lot of the brunt of the force before it can get to your heart. So one of the reasons why maybe some of the ribs are so sensitive and easy to break is because and think about this when it comes to seatbelts, right? If you increase the time it takes, or the time it takes for something to be impacted, it lessens the force. So if it's easier for those or not seatbelts, but the way that they've designed cars over time is they make it now so that it's easy for them to be totaled. It's easier for them to actually get crinkled up, because if the impact is mostly focused in the front of the car, that takes the force away from the person inside the car. It's the same thing with our ribs. Our ribs are designed to take the brunt of the damage to protect it from getting to our heart. So ribs, and then specifically what type of rib, right? Your ribs up higher are going to actually be thicker than the ones on the bottom. So it all just depends on how you get hit, how you fall. Our ribs are actually designed in such a way that it's more difficult to break, but once you get exposure, you can break them, right? So but going back to how the circulation and the gas exchange work, they work together. Your heart is constantly pumping blood in and out of your lungs and to the rest of your body. And that is so that it creates this very in tune thing, this in tune system. So what happens when you breathe in? And I want everybody, all 17 of you, to answer this question. The rib muscles relax, the diaphragm contracts, the air leaves the alveoli, or the air moves between the chest wall and the lung. What happens when you breathe in? Okay. What happens? I should see more. Okay. All right. So 2 or 4. Okay. All right. All right, I'm seeing more twos this time. Okay. Good, good. Okay, so we are thinking that the diaphragm contracts, and just ignore this. This is if I had given you access to it, this would have reflecting your guys' answer, but I didn't do that. So yes, the answer is that the diaphragm contracts. Yes, exactly. So remember, when we breathe in, it's pushing our lungs out, it's puffing us up, right? It's causing our diaphragm, and depending on where we breathe, and that's something that we have to practice. It's not natural for us to breathe into our diaphragm. We really have to focus that direction of breath, but that is what happens. We start to do that. So let's think about this question. Premature infants, so infants that are born before they're fully developed, sometimes die of lung collapse and other lung problems. What might preemies, and preemies are the name that they're given, these infants that are born before they're mature, be missing, and how could this be remedied? I'm going to put you guys back into those breakout groups. So really quickly, I want you to talk about this. Premature infants sometimes die of lung collapse and other problems. Why might that be? What are they missing? Okay, so what are preemies may not have developed yet? So I'm going to put you guys back into the same rooms, and then we will come back. All right. So what do you guys think? Why do you think this happens to some of the premature infants? Why do our lungs collapse or their lungs collapse? Any ideas? What's missing? Okay, so the infant might be missing some bronchi. Good. That's true. Yeah, what else? Bronchies. Yeah, good. What other part of the lungs could they possibly be missing? The bronchies and okay, they're not fully grown. Yeah, they're not fully developed. So what part of them are probably not developed? We've got the bronchies. What else do we know specifically that kind of gives it that shape, the lung tissue? Good. Yeah. So we know that there may be these things, specifically what is where, it keeps it from collapsing, right? We talked about how this one part of the lung has this um, was one oily substance in their membrane to keep it from sticking. You guys remember what that is? It's the site of the gas exchange. The alveoli. Good. Good. Or alveoli. Great. Exactly. So now let's talk a little bit more specific of what's going on. So in the alveolus, which is plural for alveoli, we have these like sacs, right? Remember, we talked about how there are these little sacs that they are the ones that are getting bigger and getting smaller. The respiratory surface is made up of the alveoli and capillary walls. So we talk about these capillaries. They're specifically these parts where the cell exchange is going to happen. When we talk about the respiratory surface is made up of the alveoli and capillary walls. So that's where the blood comes through. The walls of the capillaries and the alveoli may share the same membrane. So they might share the same membrane, right? And that's because things need to leave, things need to come out. So the best is if they have a very similar membrane, or at least on top of one another. So then when we take a look here is from the pulmonary artery, remember that's coming from the heart, we've got deoxygenated blood, meaning it's blood that doesn't have oxygen in it. They just release the carbon dioxide. And as it goes through, they didn't release the carbon dioxide, just doesn't have oxygen. And as it goes through the alveoli, the oxygen is coming in. They take in the oxygen through the diffusion into the red blood cells, and then they diffuse the carbon dioxide out. And then that's where we have this exhalation process happen. And then that leaves the alveoli, which means we breathe it out. And then the newly oxygenated blood goes to the pulmonary vein. And that is what pumps the blood to the rest of your body. Okay, so that's what's happening in your alveolus, and that's what's happening. And I think alveolus is actually singular, alveoli is plural. Okay, so the gas exchange. So what's actually happening when we're exchanging gases? So right here, air entering the lungs contains more oxygen and less carbon dioxide than the blood that flows in the pulmonary capillary. So remember that diffusion goes from high areas of concentration to low areas of concentration. So when we're talking about this, if there's more oxygen over here and less oxygen over here, it's going to want to go in that direction. And then the same is true. If there's more carbon dioxide over here and less carbon dioxide over here, then we want the carbon dioxide to flow out, right? So there's this oily surface that we talked about. We know that we've got our epithelial cells or our outer layer cells. We've got these collagen fibers that give it the strength or the shape. And then we've got our capillary cells, right? And that's what kind of borders it. And we allow this exchange to happen. Then the oxygen gets transported, and that's what we talk about, these hemoglobin. So specifically, remember form and function, how its specific shape of something relates to the function? Our blood cells are specifically designed in these kind of cell-like structures. And that is because the more surface area you have, the more it can flow through. And the hemoglobin is the structure that's in our blood cells that carries the oxygen. So you can see the oxygen goes to the hemoglobin, and then it gets brought to the different parts of the body. So the oxygen diffuses through the lung capillary wall. We know that the oxygen is carried to tissue bound to the hemoglobin. Again, the hemoglobin is part or inside of the blood cell, and then O2 diffuses through the tissue capillary wall. So that's how we get the oxygen to the body cell side. Lung cells, hemoglobin to the body. What are some advantages to using hemoglobin to transport oxygen? Go ahead and just shoot an answer in the chat. What are some advantages? Why is it useful? Anyone? Bueller? Bueller? You'll get that joke this Friday if you come to movie night. Okay, we're going to move on just for the sake of time. So similarly, we have this idea of carbon dioxide can dissolve in the plasma and is about 70% forms bicarbonate ions. So what we mean by that is the CO2 diffuses through the tissue. So now we've got the opposite thing going on. Good, it helps with oxygen flow. Good question, thank you. So we have these carbon dioxides, and so what's happening is that they are going through from the body back into the blood cell and is then binding to the hemoglobin or as bicarbonate and then can be out. So then carbon dioxide is carried to the lungs, and then the carbon dioxide diffuses through the capillary wall. So again, we're starting to see this exchange. Some carbon dioxide can bind to hemoglobin for transport. So we've got this really cool thing that the carbon dioxide can do. They can either form as an ion and transport themselves through the plasma through the empty space, or it can bind to the hemoglobin and also get transported to the lungs to breathe out. By the time we get to the cells use up the oxygen quickly for cellular respiration, right, to make that ATP. So what does this do to the diffusion gradient? How does this help cells take up oxygen? So if we use oxygen quickly, what does that do for the concentration gradient, right? Thinking about how there is some, that level of concentration is really what drives diffusion. So if we're depleting oxygen quickly, that means that we need to be taking in oxygen. So we continuously have this high concentration in the lungs, this low concentration out in the body. So cells create carbon dioxide during cellular respiration. So CO2 levels in the cells are higher than in the blood coming to them. So how does that help cells get rid of oxygen? Again, creating that change. So if we have more carbon dioxide in one area, it wants to leave to the areas of lower concentration. So really focusing on how everything works together to really be efficient at what it does. It wants to leave because carbon dioxide is actually a poison, right? Carbon dioxide can be considered a poisonous substance to our body. And remember that we want it to leave to make room for more oxygen. So if we have a bunch of stuff, if we have like one little sack and it's filled with carbon dioxide, there isn't enough room for oxygen to come in. So we want it to leave to make way for our oxygen, right? So let's answer this question. Diffusion of oxygen from lungs to blood is rapid because active transport moves oxygen, hemoglobin takes up oxygen, or blood plasma is oxygen rich. Why does the O2 happen quickly? Which one is it? 1, 2, or 3? Go ahead and put it in the chat. Did we talk about active transport at all? No, right? We know that this is specifically talking about passive transport. Diffusion does not require energy, so it does not require active. So then we have to go on to the next one. Hemoglobin takes up oxygen, keeping plasma concentrations low. Or is it blood plasma is oxygen rich? Okay. For the sake of time, let's see what our answer is. Our answer was 2, as a matter of fact. Most of the oxygen in blood is in the white cells, bound to the hemoglobin, combined with carbon to make carbon dioxide, or dissolved in the plasma. It is bound to the hemoglobin. So remember that oxygen specifically gets traveled by the hemoglobin in our blood cells. Okay, so before we move on, there's a couple of more. So that's really what I have for you. We have 2 minutes left, and the next couple of slides are some really graphic pictures of the lungs and what happens if we are, having a smoker's lung, if we smoke cigarettes, and what happens to our lungs, and what different conditions there are that affect our ability to breathe. So at this point, I want to say that if you are not comfortable, if you feel ill at any point, if you do not do well with seeing organs and, in live pictures, then now is probably a good time to go ahead and go to your lesson and read the rest about it, because there are going to be some gruesome pictures and we only have about a minute left. So I want to give you guys a chance to hop off if you don't want to see the images, or you can stick around for just another minute or two to see the rest of the images. Okay, so I would say now is a good time to head out if you don't like to look at pictures. But if you do, let's move on. So the next one is smoking. So this is the picture of a cell, of a lung, that has a smoker, right? So when we think about smoking, we really think about what we're putting in. By everyone, we really think about what we're putting into our lungs. So when we smoke a cigarette, there's more than just oxygen and nicotine, as we might think. There's a bunch of other things. And so what happens is, over time, our lungs are trying to get rid of all of those dangerous things. But then if we can't get rid of all of these carcinogens, then we start to realize that there is a really big issue. So specifically, besides just cancer, it can also lead to something called emphysema. And emphysema is when it becomes that dry, brittle sacs, right? So in the alveoli. So we talked about how in the alveoli, exactly, there is tobacco and nicotine. When we talked about the alveoli, we talked about how there's that layer that creates it from being sticky. It keeps it from being sticky. It keeps it from collapsing. But then if you continue to smoke cigarettes, it can also get rid of that line in the alveoli. And you can see the type of the cells from a non-smoker versus a smoker. So we start to create these, these gaps, and it starts to get rid of those lines and create those cells to rupture or break down. There's also something called cystic fibrosis. So cystic fibrosis is an inherited disorder. So this has to do with your genes, right? And cystic fibrosis is one of the most common inherited disorders, specifically among the Caucasian population in the United States. It is caused by a single mutation in your gene. And right, it controls the balance of salt in your lungs. And if there is if you don't have a proper balance of salt, then it's going to cause your inability to absorb nutrients, right? It's going to cause a whole slew of events. We also have, so this is going to go into more detail, but typically what happens is that we don't have enough healthy cells to be able to control the breathing. So I want to kind of pause here. We're coming up to our hour, and we are coming up to the end of our lesson. So, if you're interested in learning more about cystic fibrosis, I encourage you to. I encourage you to read and research more about the lungs and how it affects our everyday language. So that way or our everyday action, so that we can make better decisions when it comes to our health. So that's everything I have for you this Tuesday. We're going to learn about vaccines when we get to the immune system, which is probably in the next unit. Okay. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your Tuesday. And if I don't see you in small group for the rest of the week, then I hope you have a great weekend. Bye, everyone. You're welcome. Bye. All right, Ellen, I have to get to my other class. All right.